That's the sound of Easter. Thank you. Dear God, in this time of rebirth, help us gather not only together, but to gather within us the energy that we do have that we sometimes lose track of as we continue in this wonderful spring to live with joy. Amen. One of the things I liked a lot about the 10 years I lived in Salt Lake City, from 2011 to 2021, before I came here, was that stuff happened there that didn't happen anywhere else. It was the perfect size place, small enough so that the playing field is a bit more level, but large enough so that amazing things are possible. For instance, 3 days after the 2016 presidential election, remember that? I ran into Senator Orrin Hatch, third in line to the presidency at the time, at my neighborhood Costco. He was buying something for a cold, and he was standing alone, waiting for something from the pharmacist there. Again, it's just the Friday after the Tuesday election, and I saw an opening. So I walked up and told him I hoped that he'd do his best to rein in our brand new, impulse-driven president-elect when he needed it. And Senator Hatch was very gracious and acknowledged the reason for my comment, but expressed some optimism that he wouldn't have to. He said the new president had matured a lot during the campaign. Well, sensing from the incredulous look on my face that I wasn't exactly buying that, he then acknowledged that Donald, being Donald, might backslide occasionally. Anyway, the conversation continued jovially. Senator Hatch was extremely gracious, asked me what I did. I told him I was one of the pastors of Wasatch Presbyterian Church in the city there, and he knew the church. One of his cousins lived right next door to us. But then if you're a Mormon living in Utah, one of your cousins lives next to just about everybody. Anyway, I told him I was a Democrat and thanked him for teaming up with Senator Edward Kennedy to pass a lot of really good legislation back in the 80s and 90s. I told him I hoped we might see that kind of partnership across the aisles again sometime. Well, the pharmacist returned with what looked like a lifetime supply of Flonase, Costco. So the senator balked a little when the pharmacist said it's going to cost him $39. While he was thinking it over, I saw another opening. So I spoke up and told him I'd be happy to pay for it. I said that we had a deacon's fund at my church, and we sometimes helped people out with their prescriptions, drug costs being so very high. And he gave me a long look and then politely declined. Well, I took that cheery exchange as something of a gift to me that week, gobsmacked as I was about the election and what the next 4 years or 8 years, I was wondering, might look like. At such times, I always remember, I've mentioned this to you all before, my mother, who once in 1968 said, God would never allow Richard Nixon to be president of this country. It makes me laugh today because she ended up voting for him when he ran for re-election 4 years later. But fact is, and I'm getting to the meat of this, God allows a lot of things. And the text from the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk is about how one man dealt with that reality. Habakkuk's circumstances are more extreme than ours, Violence surrounds his capital city, Jerusalem. The enemy this time is Babylon. Their skill at striking terror in the hearts of their adversaries is legendary. How is one to live in such a time, he wonders. The threat of violence from outside is tremendous, but there's also a threat of violence within the walls of Jerusalem. There's violence being carried out against widows and orphans within the city. There are endless litigations going on. All this weighs heavily on the prophet. He comes very, very close to self-destruction. He becomes weary to the bone. Why does this go on, he wonders. Why would a good God allow it? Now, Habakkuk is not tempted to doubt the existence of God, not for a minute. No, Habakkuk retains a lively faith throughout his time of complaining. He simply cannot understand why God, who he believes has a supreme regard for the poor and the powerless, can let unspeakable things go on. Think today of Gaza. Why doesn't God rise up and act? Habakkuk wonders. He's one of those who prays and prays for peace and sees nothing on the horizon but war. He's like one who prays and prays for healing at the bedside of a loved one, and yet death keeps sticking its ugly head into the sick room. Habakkuk's complaints to God are never done for the sake of complaining. He simply believes that his heart is like God's heart, huge and vulnerable. So like all the prophets of Israel and Judah, his purpose is to try and incite God to act. He waits not resignedly, but with real resolution. I will stand at my watchpost, he says, station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what God will say to me and what God will answer concerning my complaint. Then the Lord answered me and said, write this vision, make it plain on tablets so that even a runner may read it. Write it big, he's saying. Put it on a billboard so someone who's sprinting by it might see it, not a jogger. No, this is for someone who's running to his broker in order to cash everything in during a market free fall. He's running like somebody fleeing an earthquake who's not at all sure which way to run, but he's going like heck. Those are kind of weak examples, though. The billboard size sign is, in the end, really for anyone running away from anything because he's tempted to believe that lies, not truth, will have the last word. God tells the prophet to write his truth on tablets of stone so it will last, because it may well have to last long enough to be read by those who will come generations later. Those who will eventually understand what is really happening in their time, you know. Those who will feel the same bone weariness that comes as a result of the accumulation of all that stress and suffering. It's a message for people who are sick and tired of bad news, right? It's for people whose first prayer when they see the morning headline is, "How long, O Lord?" It's for people who can't bring themselves to look at the news at all. How many wonderful people have to die of cancer before it will end? How many have to perish in these wars that spring up all over the globe, one after another, or one on top of another, as we're seeing now with Iran and Israel? Lord, how many? How many children have to be lost due to assault weapons before a critical mass of legislators will buck the pressure of the gun lobby and do something serious to turn back the wave of gun madness? What do you do when you begin to feel an exile, in your own country, no matter what your political affiliation? You know what that feels like, right? Well, rather than despair, I choose this morning to take my cue from the meme that we use to promote our 2022 stewardship campaign. I still keep it close to my eyes in my office, and it acts like Habakkuk's billboard. It says, today I will choose joy. Joy, and hope, they're good for the heart. Despair, not so much. I'm thinking of this because, last week, instead of a sermon, you listened to a passionate discussion between our terrific associate pastor, Don Ludwig, and his South African friend, Hein van Wyk. Hein spoke of the stubborn problem of the lack of a concept of an open future among the poor and oppressed in South Africa. He said there is a stuckness about South Africa. The poor there have no hope for the future, no vision, no sense that they or their children might have a better life. Their sense is that history happens to them instead of them having any opportunity to make history themselves. Hein said that only if you have hope can you turn your stumbling blocks into stepping stones, remember? He said his mission in his country is to help the underclass there become victors instead of victims. He wants them to know that history can be as much about the future as it is about the past. That's exactly the attitude Habakkuk decides is called for. God's answer through the prophet goes this way. Look at the proud, the haughty. Their spirit is not right within them, but the righteous by their faithfulness shall live. Not faith, faithfulness. This isn't merely about believing stuff. This involves something much deeper. Faithfulness here does not mean believing in God so you won't go to hell. Not at all. Habakkuk's idea of faithfulness means living out of an implicit trust in God no matter what. Trust in the God who made a beautiful universe and wills for good to triumph in the end, even if we will perish before the day comes when our vision of peace is the prevailing understanding. Remember the big sign, the need for the message to be written on stone tablets so it will last generations. Here is what faithfulness means for Habakkuk. It comes in chapter 3 of this little book we're looking into today. Though the fig tree does not blossom, and no fruit is on the vine, though the produce of the olive fails, and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold, and there's no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. It takes seriously the Apostle Paul's sense that God is not some great being on some lofty throne high up there in the stratosphere, but is in fact the God, quote, in whom we live and move and have our being. The Apostle Paul valued this little book of Habakkuk above everything else in the Hebrew Testament. He faced so many difficulties and disappointments, and yet in one notable letter, he quotes Habakkuk. The just shall live by his or her faithfulness. That's what he said. By the most basic acts of faithfulness in times of the greatest stress and the greatest temptation to despair. So how do we do this in 224? There's a lot of ways. You're probably already investing yourself in some of those. I hope you are. But let me suggest one more. It can be as simple as choosing to bring a child into the world. Now, I'm not recommending this as a remedy for depression or as a remedy for troubles in a marriage. I mention it because it is the ultimate investment in hope that there is. Why do it? Knowing the score as we do, knowing how hard this life can be, wondering as we do what kind of world our children will inherit. You know, I've studied a lot of the world's religions, and though there is something wonderful to be learned from every one of the world's enduring religious traditions, none, I believe, can compete with Judeo-Christianity when it comes to one four-letter word, hope. Hope. Now, let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about here that we can hang on to. Some of you, I know, have read the memoir entitled When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. In May of 2013, at the age of 36, Dr. Paul was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. At first, he prepared for death. Then he and his wife, Lucy, decided to have a child. And here's what he said. It's an amazing book. I haven't read anything in the last 11 years that quite equals it for profundity. Flush in the face of mortality, many decisions became compressed, urgent and unreceding. Foremost among them, for us, should Lucy and I have a child. Even if our marriage had been strained toward the end of my residency as a doctor, we had always remained very much in love. Our relationship was still deep in meaning, a shared and evolving vocabulary about what mattered. If human relations form the bedrock of meaning, it seemed to us that rearing children added another dimension to that meaning. It had been something we'd always wanted, and we were both impelled by the instinct to do it still, to add another chair to our family's table. Both of us yearning to be parents, we each thought of the other. Lucy hoped I had years left, but understanding my prognosis, she felt that the choice whether to spend my remaining time as a father should be mine. What are you most afraid or sad about? She asked me one night as we were lying in bed. Leaving you, I told her. I knew a child would bring joy to the whole family, and I couldn't bear to picture Lucy husbandless and childless after I died. But I was adamant that the decision ultimately be hers. She would likely have to raise the child on her own, after all, and to care for both of us as my illness progressed. Will having a newborn distract from the time we have together, she asked. Don't you think saying goodbye to your child will make your death more painful? Wouldn't it be great if it did? I said. Lucy and I both felt that life wasn't about avoiding suffering. Years ago, he says, it had occurred to me that Darwin and Nietzsche agreed on one thing. The defining characteristic of the organism is striving. Describing life otherwise was like painting a tiger without stripes. After so many years of living with death, I'd come to understand that the easiest death wasn't necessarily the best. We talked it over. Our families gave their blessing. We decided to have a child. We would carry on living instead of dying. Carrying on living. Making an investment in tomorrow. Hold on to the truth, no matter what anyone is saying. The text from Habakkuk says, stay at your post, be vigilant, not a vigilante. Make plans and execute them. Keep watch. Do the work your hand finds to do in your garden, in your neighborhood, at your church, with all your might. Look for those moments when the hand of God is breaking through. Keep hope alive in big things and little, in things global and in things right here close to home. For the truly just in this world choose to live like this, faithfully, one day at a time, watching for justice aching to be born. Amen.